Welcome back, folks. Midterm exams done. That means we're going to continue on in the textbook. We're now on chapter 8. Chapter 8 looks at gender and religion. Very contentious issue. No matter what your faith is, even if you have no faith, religion and gender, or religion has a very large impact on gender and on the discussion of gender itself. When we think about gender, we think about it most likely in reference to Western societies, and religion has long been bound up with the questions of gender. As I said, religion and gender go hand in hand, and one of the ways that we know what the appropriate gender roles are is because it's been written in the important religious texts. Questions like, is God a man? Why do most of the world's great traditions have male prophets? What sorts of relationship does God prescribe, and which ones does God proscribe? Do men and women have equal roles in various religious ministries? These are things that these are questions that have driven us for thousands of years, and there are clear indications that men are written more favorably in these scripts than women. And it's not a far leap to say that this is a byproduct of male control over a long period of time. Males, once they achieve that dominant position, they begin to justify that dominant position through all of the institutions in society. And there's no reason to think that religion is not part of this gender construction. Gender especially becomes problematic for women as we get into the more monotheistic faiths like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, where the prophets are males and God is ultimately a male. That's not the way it's always been. I read a book called Ishmael. Many of you might have read it yourself, and it tells a story of when the earth goddesses and gods existed and how they were run over by the sky gods. And the earth gods primarily saw Earth as one of the main goddesses, Gaia, and then they had multiple deities that represented many of the supernatural phenomenon that we couldn't quite understand or explain as humans. Greek mythology, of course, is laden with this. Goddesses are extremely important in the Greek mythology. As a matter of fact, characters like Helen and Athena prove to be the more rational, calm-headed gods that put in check the very emotionally charged Zeus. Hinduism also holds that there are many gods and goddesses, and Buddhism recognizes a godlike potential in all of us. So Hinduism and Buddhism have been along way longer than the monotheistic traditions, and it's not a coincidence that those older faiths have taken in consideration both males, the importance and equality of men and women. Matriarchies and polytheistic cultures gradually were replaced by those monotheistic ones. All of a sudden, we went from Gaia being a female existing here on Earth to the assertion that God is a male and exists somewhere up there. We don't know where God is. That's a supernatural leap at least with Gaia, Gaia being understood as the earth, you could find God every day. You were living on God. Now, all of a sudden, God's someplace else. And he is up there wagging his finger at us, telling us to behave. Of course, you can imagine when we move from a goddess-oriented female faith to a God-oriented male faith, many new codes of gender are written into these new monotheistic scriptures. And women are subjugated to a lesser state than men. Now, even though these monotheistic traditions did a pretty good job of stamping out the goddess cultures, and the Catholics in particular, they were very, very committed to getting rid of, exterminating any pagan groups that existed in their midst. Catholicism saw it as a affront to the rightful interpretation of God that Christianity was bringing forward. And so they went out and they exterminated wherever they found pagan communities. So even though there was a massive extermination project going on, ultimately some of the beliefs and some of the organizations and some of the communities continued to exist. Wicca. I have a few friends of mine who are Wiccans. They're witches. Historically, we've been taught that witch is something negative. And that really comes from this attack by monotheistic traditions on the old pagan traditions. One way that you steer people away from pagan philosophies is that you demonize them. Witchcraft, a witch is evil. They cast spells on you. They trick you. They kill you. They eat you. They are all things that are bad. But ironically, witch means wise one. That's not what you would think in the 21st century after about 1,000 years of demonizing witchcraft or demonizing Wicca. We know that women were healers. They were midwives. And by being healers and midwives, they held respectful positions within society. And we also know that powerful women did exist, and they often were independent of men, which for a long period of time, until just recently, this was the state of women. That was just the way it was. They were not in powerful positions. They were disempowered and they were dependent on men. So when we look back in history, we find that women have held positions of power. Women have been powerful. Women have been respected in their communities. But with the rise of monotheistic traditions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, women's roles change fundamentally. And the reasons that these changes happened with the rise of monotheism are not always that the prophets themselves spoke this way. Jesus was actually more concerned. He was as concerned with women as he was men. Jesus did not see women as devalued. He saw all of humanity as being equal, and Muhammad said women should have rights. But it's those that become the prophets that change the message over time. So St. Paul, he was most concerned with the subordination of women. And Paul did everything he could to make sure that women's position was subordinate to men. He wrote, wives should be subject to their husbands, and wives should, or the head of every woman is her husband. This follows the head of every man is Jesus. So in Paul's mind, the head of every man is Jesus, and the head of every woman is her husband, which means that she is subordinate to her husband. We see this resurface again, and not resurface, it's always been there, but be reiterated in 1998 at the Southern Baptist Convention, where they stated that the wife should submit graciously to her husband. I mean, the Bible tells us that women were made from man. Adam, and God took Adam's rib and shaped woman for Adam. So if women come from man, then women therefore must be subordinate to man. We can look at these monotheistic traditions as theologies of inequality. When we look at Orthodox Judaism, we see that women may not be rabbis. They cannot read the Torah during worship. They cannot sing in synagogue. They cannot lead a service. They cannot initiate marriage or divorce. And they cannot pray at the Western Wall. So many of the major traditions of Judaism are withheld from women. Only men count towards a minyan being a quorum of 10 Jews that must be present in order to worship. So you can have 100 women wanting to worship, and you have 9 men, and you cannot have a quorum. You cannot have a minyan. And therefore, unless there are 10 men, women cannot gather together to pray in the appropriate way that is required through Orthodox Judaism.